Hi, welcome to Under Pressure 2020, Understanding Stress, Disaster Psychology, and how you can help yourself and others. My name is Katrina French, and I am a disaster services specialist in the Disaster Services Unit at the Corporation for National and Community Service. The entire disaster services team is excited that you've chosen this workshop. 2020 has been a stressful year, full of change, disruption, uncertainty, and stress, thanks in large part to the coronavirus pandemic that swept our country and the world. We hope that this workshop will be helpful to you personally and professionally. Now, none of us in the disaster services unit are mental health experts. So you might be wondering what qualifies us to talk about this. The simple answer is that together we have 27 years of disaster experience, and we've collectively responded to over 50 major disasters in the country, the territories, and even internationally. Working in this field can be incredibly mentally and emotionally stressful. And so, as a self preservation, we've learned how to manage our own stress well. And in order to be really effective at our jobs, we've had to understand and be able to pick up on stress in others. Much of this content has been adapted from a portion of our AmeriCorps disaster response team introductory training that we use with our AIDART staff and members that we send out under a FEMA mission assignment. This training helps better prepare them to survive the stressors of a disaster deployment, as well as work more effectively with disaster survivors and with other responders. We've also worked with mental health experts and our most experienced AIDART staff to create this content. Now for a little bit of housekeeping. You have access to a participants guide, and we highly recommend that you go ahead and download that. If you can't print it out, that's okay. There's a couple of pages in the back of that guide that we'll be using during the discussion board and during the live session, and it's helpful information to have at your fingertips. And lastly, discussing stress, particularly when we're already stressed, can actually help fuel anxiety and other symptoms of stress. So if you find yourself becoming anxious while you view this, go ahead and feel free to pause and take a couple of deep, slow breaths to kind of clear out that anxiousness. All right, let's get started. During this part of the workshop, we'll discuss understanding stress, impact and symptoms of stress, coronavirus stress and disaster psychology, how to combat disaster distress and compassion fatigue, and we'll talk about what to do when self care isn't enough and what resources may be available to you. When we get to the live session, we'll provide an opportunity for you to ask us questions or do deeper dives into this content. So, as you go through this recording, please take note of any questions or content that you'd like us to go into more depth during the live session. During this session, we'll also have group conversations where we can share techniques and practices that have helped each of us ease stress, and we'll also build a self care first aid list. Our workshop learning objectives. By the end of this workshop, attendees will understand the causes of stress and impacts to physical, mental, and emotional health, identify symptoms of stress in yourself and others, understand self care benefits, methods, and strategies to promote better mental and emotional health and resilience, understand disaster distress in disaster survivors and responders, and identify and apply helpful actions to assist survivors. So let's start with an overview of stress. What is stress? How does it impact us? And how does it show up in our lives? We'll start by focusing on answering those questions first. The medical or biological definition of stress is a physical, mental, or emotional factor that causes bodily or mental tension. But not all tension and stress is bad. This graph shows the performance stress level spectrum, and it does a great job of breaking down where stress becomes bad for us and where it's helpful for us. If we think about stress as a spectrum instead of a monolith, that can really help us see moments of stress as changeable. Then the stress is something that we know we can manage rather than something that just can't be helped. So let's start with looking at the characteristics of each phase of stress shown in this spectrum. We'll start with the lame phase. This phase in the green area is the phase where there's little stimulation and it's generally typified by very little physical or mental stimulus. Some people may find this phase boring, while others may find it very relaxing. And fun fact, this phase is often the goal of Zen meditation. The next phase is the healthy phase. This is where we perform at our best. We aren't overly challenged and we're not under challenged. Many people describe this phase as being in a flow state or in the zone. Here we are seeing optimal performance and attention. Feelings of excitement, enjoyment, the ability to lose track of time are common. This phase is constructive stress and is also sometimes called eustress. Next up is the sick phase. Here's where our common negative connotations of stress begin. If you continue to push too hard from the peak performance, we start to see fatigue setting in. This is commonly maintaining our attention or activity for too long or having to endure stressors for too long. This is also where stress becomes increasingly toxic and we begin to see those symptoms of stress start to show up. Finally, at the end of the spectrum, in the darker red area, is the disease phase. Here's where we begin to see significant distress symptoms that can have severe impact on our emotional, mental, and physical health, our relationships, and even how we feel about ourselves or others. So, what really causes stress? Well, simply anything that makes you feel stress is a cause of stress. Sitting in a traffic jam, busy schedules, financial health or worries, also, and so many more things. We call these things stressors. Often, stressors are things that cause recurrent perceived negative impact to our environment, our expectations, our habits, or are the things that are linked to upsetting experiences or phobias. What's so interesting about stress is that it's both universal and unique. It's universal in that every person at one point or another has experienced stress to some extent. However, no two people experience stress the same way, which is what makes it unique. We each react differently to stressors. Some things that can be highly stressing for one person are only a mild inconvenience or maybe even thrilling. Think about roller coasters. Some people have a severe phobia of roller coasters, and even the thought is enough to cause severe anxiety in those folks. But other people really enjoy roller coasters and may find the experience to be exhilarating, and they may feel actually less stressed after they've been on a roller coaster. We each react differently to stressors. So, our past experiences, our physical, mental, and emotional health all predispose us to being sensitive to some stressors over others. Now that we understand what stress is and understand better the phases of stress and sources of stress, let's take a deeper look at what happens in the sick and disease phases as stress symptoms show up. People experiencing these phases will all react differently to their stress. Their symptoms can vary from one episode to another. As you enter the sick phase of stress, you might find that you only start with one or two symptoms, but the longer you're in the sick phase or move into the disease phase, the number and variety of symptoms tends to grow. Symptoms of stress can manifest as psychological, cognitive, emotional, physical, and behavioral issues. This chart lists a sampling of these symptoms, but it's not comprehensive. So, on the graph, you'll see the psychological: negative self talk, uncontrollable intrusive thoughts, self doubt. Psychological is the things that we tell ourselves. Next is cognitive. So, this is the way that we perceive information, the way we're taking in information. And those stress symptoms are commonly the inability to remember a reason, confusion, or inability to concentrate. Next, we get into the emotional behavioral. And so, this is how we're feeling and how we're demonstrating our feeling to others. So, often these can be things like easily angered, irritability, substance abuse. You might see tick up, additional tension. And then also at the very end, we have the physical. So, this is how we're feeling in our body. Are we sleeping too much, too little, increased or decreased appetite, muscle tension, neck, jaw pain, headaches? That's where we start to see those come through. If left untreated, if we stay in that toxic stress area, that disease phase for too long, stress can have lasting impacts to our health. And in some cases, it's non reversible. These impacts include cardiovascular disease, such as heart disease, high blood pressure, abnormal heart rhythms, heart attacks, and stroke, obesity and other eating disorders, reproductive health issues, skin and hair problems such as acne, psoriasis, eczema, permanent hair loss, gastrointestinal problems such as GERD, gastritis, ulcerative colitis, and irritable colon, and finally, long term toxic stress can also lead to changes in the brain and our ability to process information. Quite literally, stress can cause brain damage. Mental and emotional stress cause real impacts to our physical health and our relationships and how we can even feel about ourselves. In the US and in many other places, mental health is stigmatized. Often, these stigmas approach challenges with mental health as character flaws. They are not. In order to be healthier individuals and help those around us during stressful events, we must change our thinking and our language about mental health, understand our stressors and our reactions to them, and plan for how we mitigate them. So let's get into some of the stressors of 2020. I'm sure all of us has felt to one extent or another the stress that 2020 has brought us. The American Psychological Association has been issuing stress in the time of COVID-19 since May 2020. They've been studying Americans and their response to COVID 19, police brutality, governmental response, and other issues on Americans' minds. Their studies have found that US adults are citing the following as significant sources of stress. 84% of responding adults cite federal response to COVID 19 as a significant source of stress. 72% are citing their state response. 71% of parents are highly worried about the impact of their child's social development. 65% are citing stress due to the coronavirus in general. 64% are concerned about their local government response to COVID 19. And 60% cite stress related to police violence towards minorities. Additionally, these reports show that parents are far more stressed than their non parent peers, and that isn't surprising given school closures, openings, online education, caring for children, all while still managing their work and other responsibilities. So, what does that tell us? 2020 is the most stressful year most of us have ever experienced. It's also important to think about the pandemic as a disaster event. The difference between an emergency and a disaster is often the magnitude of impact to people, systems, and services. This pandemic is a multi layered disaster event that we're seeing play out in real time. If we view this as the largest modern disaster event to occur in our country and in the world, this also helps us to frame stress impacts as something that is happening to all of us and not just a select few. And while we haven't seen or responded to an event this large, complex, or challenging before, we can take what we've learned from our previous disaster responses and apply what is helpful for this response and discard the rest. So let's look a little bit more deeply at disaster psychology and the impacts to disaster survivors and responders alike. If we're viewing the pandemic as a disaster, we can all be considered disaster survivors. It's helpful to understand the typical disaster survivor process to better inform where we are in this individually and within our own communities, so that not only can we help ourselves, but others. Let's first distinguish between stress and trauma. Trauma is caused by a sudden event that dramatically explodes into our lives and changes the way that we perceive the world. A traumatic event is often life threatening. Those who experienced trauma feel like they have no control, while those under toxic stress often retain some feeling of control. I think it's only fair to say that this pandemic has been traumatic for a lot of us and highly stressful for almost all of us. It's also important to note that the coronavirus pandemic does not have a fixed response timeline, as shown in the graph. We are seeing response and early recovery phase relapse, which adds additional stress to disaster survivors and to responders alike. And what I mean by relapsing is we saw that quick close down of the country in March and April. And then as we slowly reopened, when cases went high, some other places have had to close back down. The graph was provided by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. This agency has studied reactions of disaster survivors over the years and has developed this graphic. On the left of the graph, we see the emotional highs and lows scale. On the bottom, the timeline of the disaster event as it moves from impact, response, and into recovery phases. Inside the graph, we see the emotional highs and lows typical of disaster survivors as they move toward recovery. These phases involve pre disaster and warning, impact, rescue, heroic, honeymoon, disillusionment, and reconstruction. And these phases have different characteristics and typical emotional responses. Let's start with the pre disaster and warning phase. This phase is characterized by fear and uncertainty. There may be specific reactions the community experience depending on the type of disaster. Disasters with no warning can cause feelings of vulnerability and a lack of security, fears about the future, and a sense of loss of control or the loss of the ability to protect yourself and your family. On the other hand, disasters with warning can cause guilt or self blame for failure to heed warnings. The pre disaster phase may be as short as a few minutes to a few hours, such as during a tornado, or it can be as long as many days, weeks, or even months, such as the hurricane season and this pandemic. The impact phase is characterized by a range of intense emotional reactions. As with the pre disaster phase, the specific reactions also depend on the type of disaster that is occurring. Low, slow threat disasters have psychological effects that are different from those of rapid, dangerous disasters. As a result, these reactions can range from shock to overt panic. Initial confusion and disbelief typically are followed by a focus on self preservation and family protection. The impact phase is usually the shortest of the 6 phases of disaster. The heroic phase is characterized by a high level of activity with low level of productivity. During this phase, there's a sense of altruism, and many community members exhibit adrenaline induced rescue behavior. As a result, risk assessment can be impaired. The heroic phase often passes quickly into the honeymoon phase. This phase is characterized by a dramatic shift in emotion. During the honeymoon phase, disaster assistance is readily available. The community starts to bond. Optimism exists that everything will return to normal quickly. As a result, numerous opportunities are available for providers of service and organizations to establish and build rapport with affected people and groups, and for them to build those relationships with stakeholders. The honeymoon phase typically lasts only a few weeks. The next is disillusionment, and it's in stark contrast to the honeymoon phase. During the disillusionment phase, communities and individuals realize the limits of disaster assistance. As optimism turns to discouragement and stress continues to take a toll, negative reactions such as physical exhaustion or substance abuse may begin to surface. The increasing gap between need and assistance leads to feelings of abandonment, especially as the larger community returns to business as usual. There may be an increased demand for services as individuals and communities become ready to accept support. The disillusionment phase can last many months to years. It's often extended by one or more trigger events, such as anniversaries or other disasters. Finally, in the reconstruction phase, this phase is characterized by an overall feeling of recovery. Individuals and communities have resumed responsibility for rebuilding their lives, and people adjust to the new normal while continuing to grieve losses. The reconstruction phase often begins around the anniversary of the event of the disaster and may continue for some time beyond that. Following catastrophic events or very large scale events, the reconstruction phase may last for many years. Understanding these typical reactions can help us pinpoint where we are personally on this scale. During and after natural disasters, we don't have to look far to find an array of upsetting experiences or stressors. Seeing homes, businesses, and other important places damaged or destroyed, days or weeks without power, seeing people hurt or displaced from their homes, and more. The coronavirus pandemic has caused massive layoffs, school closures, limited social gatherings, turned work life where possible from something that happens outside of the home to something that is happening inside the home. We're spending more time with our families and those we live with than we ever have in our entire lives, and that can make for stress. Additionally, many of us know people who have had COVID 19, know people who work in essential jobs and are more easily exposed to it. We know older folk and may know people that have other health conditions that make them more susceptible, or we may have our own vulnerabilities that make the situation more stressful. We don't know yet when we'll be able to resume public life and don't know what the new normal will look like yet. All of these things can cause trauma and toxic stress. So, disaster survivors and responders alike can be affected psychologically by a disaster, and trauma can be direct or secondary. Direct trauma comes from witnessing and experiencing traumatic events directly in person. Disaster survivors usually have this kind of trauma. Secondary trauma comes when a person repeatedly hears others with direct experience of the traumatic event recount their experiences. This is also called vicarious trauma. This is common in human service fields such as paramedics, doctors, social workers, case managers, and disaster responders. Though it can happen to anyone, particularly if people consume a great deal of media about the traumatic event. Trauma will cause stress symptoms, and the most common in disaster are anger, fear of recurrence, denial, eating too much too little, increased self medication, headaches, and chest pains. As with stress symptoms we've reviewed before, psychological symptoms can be very similar, and these symptoms are the most common. So, disaster responders can be challenged by compassion fatigue. Let's take a little bit of a closer look at what conditions predispose us to compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue is a fatigue, emotional distress, or even apathy common with those that care for others. It's a pretty common risk factor for disaster responders and has two parts: burnout and secondary traumatic stress. We've already talked about secondary traumatic stress, so let's focus on burnout. Burnout can happen in every profession and every kind of work environment, and it's often caused by a lack of control, or at least a feeling of lack of control, unclear job expectations, activity extremes, so having long periods to do little or not much to do, and swinging from that into a high demand for action, a lack of social support, and a work life imbalance. Compassion fatigue inhibits our ability to care for others, lowers our empathy, and can have serious negative impacts to the work that we are trying to accomplish. Opposite of compassion fatigue is compassion satisfaction, and that's about the pleasure that you derive from performing service. It's characterized by feelings of positivity, excitement, and enjoyment of doing your work. It's often related to providing care, working with colleagues, beliefs about yourself, and or beliefs related to your mission, and altruism. For AmeriCorps personnel, we often describe compassion satisfaction as including the warm, fuzzy feeling that service instills. In order to foster compassion satisfaction and fight compassion fatigue, we have to care for ourselves by ensuring that we are getting enough rest, recreation, proper nutrition, and exercise. To ensure that we're meeting this need, we must create and use a self care plan. But before we do that, let's take a look at the common work life dynamics happening in 2020. So, these conditions can severely limit what we're able to do to take care of ourselves or cause additional stress, both of which make us more susceptible to compassion fatigue. Tight living and working spaces. If all members of your family are working or schooling from home, it's unlikely that your home was set up for everyone to constantly be present, which can set up an environment for conflict and stress. We've seen off and on food supply and medication shortages since March. These impacts are likely more challenging for those at the lower end of the financial spectrum than those with more resources. These shortages can often contribute to stress by stimulating scarcity thinking, leading some who can afford to hoard food and supplies and also leave those without resources the necessity that they need. Privacy and getting emotional distance can be especially difficult during the coronavirus pandemic. If all of your family is home all the time, you may not have the physical distance you need for privacy. Gaining emotional distance is also quite challenging as the pandemic is a constant topic on the news, on social media, in conversations, and is usually not very far from our thoughts. Closures of recreation facilities such as movie theaters, restaurants, parks, and other such places may also limit our routine ways to get emotional distance from stressors. Working from home makes it really hard to stop working. When you live and work in the same area, it's really hard to turn off of work mode and turn on home mode. And you may have already found yourself working longer hours and not by intention. Finally, supporting children at home is also likely to increase stress for parents. Many parents find themselves suddenly augmenting or fully teaching their children or caring for them. uh, mm, Supporting children at home can also likely increase stress for parents. Many parents found themselves suddenly augmenting or fully teaching their children while caring for them at home and also trying to satisfy their work responsibilities. For essential employees who must leave their homes to do their jobs, many have had to rely on daycare that they normally wouldn't have had to use because of school closures, or have found challenges in finding childcare. Additionally, for those parents who have used daycare, their stress may be elevated by putting their children into a communal environment with others. Finally, children are also having increased episodes of stress. They're out of their routine, they miss their friends and teachers, and they are unable to play with children the way that they used to. So, how do we manage and reduce our stress? Well, there are two concepts that are helpful here: stress resistance and stress resilience, both of which can be fostered and strengthened. So, let's take a closer look at what factors help contribute to that. Stress resistance is the ability to let stress roll off of your back. Stress resistance is the ability to recover quickly from episodes of stress. It's really important that we don't confuse resilience and endurance. Often in American culture, we equate the ability to endure hardship or stress as a sign of strength. But if that endurance causes toxic stress and diminishes our performance and our health, then it's not really productive and certainly not a sign of strength. Both stress resistance and resilience can be cultivated. The following factors help increase stress resistance and or stress resilience. Supportive networks. People who have strong and supportive relationships with family and friends, have deep trust relationships that allow them to be open and honest and vulnerable about what is causing them stress. These networks also provide assurance that the people in these relationships will be believed, empathized, and supported in healthy ways. And what I mean by supported in healthy ways is that when you're speaking to those that you're confiding in, that they're really listening to you and being supportive. If you find yourself talking and the person you're talking to is using phrases like, well, if you think that was stressful, let me tell you about my stress, or buck up, it could be worse, they may not really be listening to you. And you may find that you don't feel better after speaking to them. Supportive people let you vent your feelings without judgment, and you can be open and honest with those folks. Sense of control. Stress resistant and resilient people have a foundational belief in their ability to influence their circumstances. Now, this may not always be fully true in every case, but what they do instead is find one focus point of control. This can look a lot like somebody who may be having challenges financially, but who choose to focus on one key area to improve, such as committing to and sticking with saving $20 out of every paycheck. Attitude. Stress resistant people have a good attitude. They're focused on the positive things going on in them and around them. Sometimes this isn't something that comes easily, but they will instead be intentional about being positive by choosing their attitude or using techniques such as listening to upbeat music or writing a gratitude list to improve their mood. Emotional control. People who are practicing good at self soothing and calming themselves are better at avoiding, handling, or recovering from stress quickly. A key component of this is self awareness. A person must be in touch with themselves on a physical, emotional, and mental level, and then be able to identify and implement self soothing or calming controls. These controls often look like intentional deep breathing, stretching, or a timeout from the stressor. Knowledge. Sometimes just knowing the facts can ease stress and worry. The more you know, the more you can plan, and having a plan often helps in dealing with stressors. For instance, A person who is afraid of flying may ease their stress by reading the safety card thoroughly, identifying the nearest exit, listening attentively to the safety briefing, and thinking through what they would do if something happens during the flight. Experience. People who have experienced high levels of stress and have learned how to manage that stress and actively seek to manage it better for future episodes are more likely to resist, endure, and recover more quickly from stressful episodes. Also, people who have had stressful experiences learn how individual stressors can affect them, and with experience, the stressor may lose some or all of its ability to incur stress. All of these factors can help us identify stress reducing activities and self care strategies to limit and mitigate the effects of stress. Managing and reducing stress. So, how do we build and strengthen our stress resiliency and resistance? One of the ways we can achieve higher stress resistance and resilience is to identify a self care plan and using self care activities as part of our daily practice and not just for emergency use when you're having a stress episode. Let's start by identifying what qualities to look for in good self care activities and practice. First off, self care activities should be helpful. I know that this may seem like a duh statement, but if the activity isn't providing rest, release, or renewal, then it's probably not very helpful. You should feel better after doing the activity. Now, not all self care activities feel comforting or pleasurable while you're doing them. Sometimes self care can feel like work, but ultimately, you should feel better after doing it. They should be flexible. Self care activities should be flexible to your changing needs. What may be calming and helpful when you're experiencing an emotional stressor may not be as helpful if you're experiencing a mental stressor. You should be able to easily identify several options and switch up the activity if you aren't finding it helpful. Self care activities should be accessible. Your self care plan should include several options to accommodate how immediately you need the activity and the resources you need to do the activity. For example, if you're beginning to feel yourself experience a quick rise of anger, muscle tension, and a headache, you may not be able to immediately stop what you're doing and go get a massage. But knowing that you can take several deep breaths, give yourself a 5-minute window to calm yourself, stretch, that can help ease those tensions. Finally, self care should be customized. All of the activities in your self care plan should be things that will work for you. Your plan won't be like anybody else's because just as one stressor may cause high levels of stress in one person, but little to none in another, so can self care activities be helpful to one person, but not helpful or even stressful to another. Many years ago, my aunt, who loves cross stitch and uses it as a self care method, um, suggested that I try cross stitch. And after 10 minutes of trying, poking myself with the needle, my eyes crossing, trying to look at the pattern, I became even more stressed than I was when I started. So I quickly put it down and said, nope, this is not for me. I will go find something else to do. Self care activities can be broken out into different categories. These activities are sensory, pleasure, mental, emotional, physical, social, and spiritual in nature. Let's look a little bit more closely at these categories. Sensory focused activities help us calm the mind by focusing on the sensations around us sights, smells, taste, and touch. This will assist in bringing your focus to the present moment and relieves worries about the past or the future. Activities that can fall into this category may be sitting outside quietly and listening to the sounds of nature, watching a campfire, doing deep breathing or breathing focused meditations, or even baking. Pleasure focused activities are pampering actions that reduce stress levels by increasing the body's production of feel good hormones, such as oxytocin, serotonin, dopamine, and endorphins. Some of these activities are treating yourself to a special meal or treat, being a tourist, watching an enjoyable movie, getting a massage, or giving yourself a pedicure or a manicure, or even writing in your journal, writing music, painting, or sculpting. Mentally focused activities help give you a sense of accomplishment and focus your thinking on a challenge. These activities can look like identifying one small action you can take with a project or a challenge that you're facing, reading something new in a topic that you're interested in but don't know a great deal about, listening to a new podcast, or Do mind puzzles like crosswords, Sudoku, or logic puzzles. Emotion focused activities help us deal with our emotions and become more adept at identifying and accepting them. These activities may include laughing as much as you can, crying if you need to, and also, fun fact, crying is the release of stress, not the buildup of it. Writing a list of what you're emotionally feeling and where you're feeling it in your body, and envisioning yourself accepting that feeling and easing it, and practicing self compassion. Physical focused activities can help calm the mind, provide physical release of tension, and or provide needed support to the body. Physical focused activities also increase happy hormones in the body and can include working out, doing yoga, playing a sport, eating healthy, such as eating naturally green vegetables and no, green gummy bears don't count, staying hydrated, avoiding caffeine, nicotine, alcohol, and other substances that deplete the body. Social focused activities help us connect to others, deepen existing relationships, and help us build trusted relationships in community. These activities include playing in person games or board games, and even right now during the pandemic, in person isn't possible, but finding a way to play those games online through Zoom or other technology, calling or texting or talking with a friend or relative, joining a book club, joining a support group, or just spending time working on a group project. Spiritually focused activities are about connecting you with your values and what really matters to you. This practice helps you remain focused and can ease mental and emotional stress. I also want to note that spiritually focused activities may be religious, but they can also be secular and can include reading poetry or inspiring quotes, attending a religious service or conducting a religious practice, lighting a candle, meditating, and even making a list of things you're grateful for. So, the best way to be proactive in decreasing and mitigating stress is by building and following a self care plan. In the discussion board, we've included a self care planning activity and we'll how to assist others. Given the challenges of our daily lives in 2020, the opportunity for compassion fatigue is high. We must be allies for each other even while we're taking care of ourselves. To do this, we must be able to identify what compassion fatigue looks like, observe that behavior in others, and then take appropriate actions to provide assistance. We've got a couple of steps for this. The first is observe. Pay attention to those around you. If you see signs of compassion fatigue, such as changes in behavior, attitude, or health, note that and then move on to assess. In assessment, you need to notice that somebody is experiencing signs of compassion fatigue, and then you need to ask yourself if you have the emotional or mental capacity to assist someone else. If the answer is no, you should talk to a trusted family member or colleague, find a friend, somebody who can also help the person that you've noticed is having trouble, and see if you can leverage their support. If you do have the capacity to assist someone else, you should offer support. You should check in with the person privately and follow the same advice when speaking to survivors. Use active listening, be friendly, be authentic, don't pry, and honor their trust. You can also offer to do self care activities together, such as going on a run or playing a game. If at any time somebody is in danger or is putting others in danger, or if someone tells you that they are considering harm to themselves or others, you should seek additional help for that person. This is the one time it's okay to violate trust. Finally, be kind. Showing kindness to yourself and others can help de escalate tensions, especially when everybody is likely facing similar challenges, stressors, and concerns. Disaster survivors can be traumatized, and we need to understand that they may not have the capacity to handle that trauma well. They may not have a full understanding of what trauma is affecting them. Some disaster survivors may express anger or blame, and it may some of it even be directed at you. It's important not to take this personally. These responses are likely due to the initial trauma of experiencing the disaster or the resulting stress and trying to recover from it. You may find that people in your life may need assistance or emotional support. Here are some of the guiding principles we use when working with disaster survivors. The first one, protect from danger. A survivor may not necessarily be aware of physical danger around them. If this occurs, try to move them to a safe area to talk. We've already talked about threatening behavior, so we'll move on. Provide accurate information, particularly in the professional sense. If you don't know the answer to a question, be upfront about that. It's okay to say, I don't know. You don't have to know all of the answers. If it's an answer you can get for the survivor, let them know that you will find out and get back to them. Give them a timeline of when to expect to hear from you and honor that timeline. You may also find in your personal life that it's really helpful, especially with children, to be very conscientious about promising when things will happen. Don't give false assurances or make promises that can't be kept. Never tell a survivor that something will be done or when it will be done unless you have absolute certainty that you can honor that commitment. When facing somebody who is working to recover, it's very tempting to be more assured in order to provide comfort. But when we can't follow through, survivors are left even more frustrated and disappointed. When we have to go back on our promises or assurances, survivors lose trust in us. This trust is already hard for us to gain and even more challenging for them to give. Recognize the importance of taking action. Doing something and being able to show immediate results are helpful for a disaster survivor to see. A work task that may seem very simple and not very impactful to you may seem to the survivor as great progress, even if it's a small issue. It can help provide hope. Use active listening. Some folks are going to want to talk about their experiences, others may not want to talk about it at all. Many times they share deeply personal concerns or relate really hard to hear stories, and it's very important to pay attention to survivors when they want to talk. Part of working through trauma and stress is being able to verbalize and process, and being able to be heard helps validate the survivor's experiences. Don't pry. Not all survivors are going to want to talk about their experiences. Some may not want to talk about the disaster event at all. If a survivor doesn't want to share their story, respect that by not asking those questions. Take your cues from the survivor. Be friendly when people are being difficult. As mentioned before, when under stress or recovering from trauma, survivors may be challenging to talk with or sometimes work with. Always being friendly and being aware that the survivor likely isn't upset with you, but with their circumstances or something completely different. They may express anger or outrage or blame. It's really important not to take any of that personally. These responses are likely due to the initial trauma of experiencing the disaster or the resulting stress in recovering from it. Helpful and unhelpful language. When we talk to people who are distressed, it's very tempting to try to offer what we think are helpful platitudes or phrases. Things like, it's all going to be okay, or you just have to hope and pray. We've all heard them before, and likely some of us have used them before. But often these kinds of statements can elicit strong negative responses, and including anger, resentment, guilt, or even shame. They can also create distrust or cause the survivor to distance themselves from you, which generally is the opposite of what we're going for. Let's look at the phrases that can be helpful and those that can be harmful. And we'll start with the unhelpful phrases. I understand. In most situations, we can't fully understand unless we've had the exact same experience. Don't feel bad. The survivor has the right to feel however they feel, and they need time to feel differently than they do right now. You're strong, or you'll get through this. Many survivors often don't feel strong at some point, and some even question if they'll ever recover. Don't cry. Disaster survivors have the right to express their feelings, and crying is a healthy way to do that. Crying also reduces momentary stress and reduces stress hormones in the body. It was fate, it was God's will, or everything happens for a reason. Using these or similar phrases is often inappropriate, especially if we don't know the person very well. If we do, the survivor's view on spirituality or religion may have changed from when we have last talked to them. It's very important that we respect however they're feeling and we shouldn't presume that we know what they believe or how they feel about what they believe after a traumatic event. It could be worse, or at least you still have, or everything will be okay. It's really up to the survivor to understand and decide whether things could be worse and if they will be okay. Instead of using these phrases, try some of these more neutral and helpful phrases instead. How can I help? If you use this phrase, you need to mean it and follow through with appropriate actions. I'm so sorry you're going through this. Affirm fear, anxiety, sorrow, or other feelings that are all natural human responses to trauma. How you feel is valid is also another great way to do this. If you need to cry, that's okay. That often helps people feel more comfortable. And sometimes, let's face it, crying often makes us feel weak. And so, if we know that we're in a space with other people that are accepting of that and understand the need for it, it can make us a little bit more comfortable in that space. That sounds like it was or is really hard. I hear you saying that sounds like a reasonable, normal, appropriate feeling to be having right now. Again, validating their feelings and showing that you're listening to what they are saying. Other actions that can be helpful: be willing to listen and not judge. Be willing to sit with the person if they don't want to talk, just quietly. If touch is warranted, offer a hug, but only do this after you've got their consent. Also, if you offer this, if you have, is there anything I can do for you? You really need to make sure that you're being specific about that offer. If you leave it wide open, generally, yeah, disaster survivors have a lot of things they need, like six good numbers in the lottery and $1 million. It's probably not something you're going to be able to provide. So target that in even more. Can I help you with cleaning up your house? Can I help you find resources to help you strengthen your self care plan? Those things are going to be most helpful. So, self care is going to help you be more resilient, but sometimes, even with the best self care and great coping skills, it's just simply not enough. Sometimes you may find that you need more assistance than you can get through working your self care plan, and that isn't a character flaw. It's brain chemistry and normal human reactions to stress and trauma. Back at the start of COVID-19 closures, I ramped up my self care because it's my job to stay informed and up to date about disaster aspects of the pandemic. Plus, I was personally affected, like all of us. I have a sister and an aunt who are both nurses, and several other family members who have greater susceptibility. There was very little space for me to get emotional and mental distance from it. So I started taking meditation breaks during the day, journaling my feelings in the morning and in the evening, talking with friends and family, playing video games to release anger and tension. And by the way, I was surprised at how well that worked. Sitting in my backyard in the morning with my coffee and just watching nature, eating something naturally green every day. I limited my news intake. I tried hard to get enough sleep every night. I avoided alcohol and started going to Zoom devotionals, something my schedule wouldn't allow for when they were being held in person. And yet, it still wasn't enough. I could feel my anger growing. I could see some of my relationships were starting to suffer. And I could just feel that I was getting drained more easily. My very well practiced and honed self care plan just wasn't giving me the mileage that I had before. So I put myself back in therapy after 2 decades. When I did this, I talked to my pastor, and she noted that everyone that she had known who had ever done therapy was back in therapy. I also called a trusted family member and told them what was going on. And they responded with, "Is it really affecting you that badly?" Now, as you can imagine, this family member isn't someone who's done therapy before and has some mental health stigmas in their own head about it. I told them no, it's not affecting me that badly yet, but I know that if I don't do something now, that it would, and that I want to come out of this pandemic at least as sane as I went into it. So if you find that you are doing your self care and you're still struggling to tell somebody, tell a trusted family member, friend, or colleague. Let others know that you need help. Find out if your employer has an employee assistance program and get counseling that might be available. It's also very likely that your local community has some low or no cost services that could help you get what the support that you need. Finally, there are two great national resources available. The first is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, and the second is the Disaster Distress Helpline. Both offer a 1 800 number and a text to talk if you don't prefer talking on the phone. The Disaster Distress Helpline is a resource we have used here in the disaster services and with our ADART teams almost as soon as they came out. They're a fantastic resource, and both of these resources provide interpretation services if they're needed. So let's move forward and think about what we do after the pandemic is over. And I know that can be really hard to visualize right now, but it's very important that we start thinking about what that space looks like because the need for self care doesn't end when the disaster does. Often, self care and recovery time are needed after long durations of extreme stress episodes to recover physically, mentally, and emotionally. The symptoms of toxic stress and compassion fatigue may linger well after life seems to return to normal. Additionally, after traumatic events, post traumatic stress disorder or PTSD can begin with symptoms such as nightmares, flashbacks, nervousness, angry outbursts, or avoidance of certain situations. This is really common. A period of reflection, contemplation, recovery, and debriefing are needed to help process the experiences and the stress that we've accumulated during the disaster event. So, continue to work your self care plan and, when needed, take time to rest. Surviving a pandemic is exhausting, emotionally and mentally challenging. And if you don't have enough recovery time, aren't paying attention to what you need and getting yourself what you need, it will impact your performance at work and in your personal life. So, the other thing that can happen after a disaster is the self care activities that we have used during the disaster that worked really well for us. Maybe we find that they're not as helpful and maybe even are triggering. I use therapy, I use music a lot to help me get through stressful times, especially when I'm feeling unmotivated. And sometimes I will link a particular song to a disaster event. And after I've moved past the disaster event, if I hear that song, start to tense up a little bit. So just pay attention to that. And it's okay to switch up your self care activities for whatever it is that you need. Thank you so much for your attention during this recorded session. Please go to the discussion board. We have a couple of activities for you to complete, including a self care planning activity. We'll be using this activity for another one during our live session. We also will have a place for you to identify topics that you'd like us to go into deeper during the live session, and you can log any questions that you may have. We'll use the discussion board to answer those questions and identify that content for the live session. We look forward to seeing you at the live session. Have a great day.